Thank you for listening to the show on Really Big Something Channel. November 20th, 2017.
We're back at it, folks. Good to have you with us as we move right along. We have seen devastating, horrifying acts against the police in Louisiana, in Florida, in Dallas, snipers, shooters in Brooklyn, police being just shot because they're police officers. And there is a thought process on the left about characterizing law enforcement as racist. Well, that's a myth. There obviously can be individuals in any group that might be racist. A small percentage of any group might fit that category. But most people, including in the police departments across this country, try to do their job the best they can under very adverse, difficult circumstances. There are FBI reports and statistics demonstrating that police are not, in fact, racist. And even though these arguments have been debunked, you see Black Lives Matter and other groups like that chastising the police as racist, which is baloney. I mean, even in Baltimore where they had the problems, the police involved, they were African-American officers, for goodness sake. So we have a false presentation of the police. Stephen Thayer is with us. Mr. Thayer is with the Law Enforcement Action Network, as a group that supports police work across this country. Mr. Thayer, it's great to have you with us. How are you, sir?
Mike, I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me on your show.
Let's go to it. The fact of the matter is the FBI Uniform Crime Reports tell us that there is not this problem. Actually, just in hard numbers, the last year that this was accounted for, the number of people killed by police officers in legitimate shootings was something like 500 whites and 250 blacks, if I remember correctly. I mean, it was 2-to-1 whites over blacks getting shot and killed by police. Is that not correct?
That's correct. This whole attitude, and this is why I came out of retirement, was to come out and support the police officers who were being wrongly accused of being racist. And you mentioned the FBI Counterintelligence Division's report on black identity extremists that came out in August. We also have to say there was one that came out about white extremists in May and got a lot of play, but no one looked at this black identity extremist thing and how they're motivated by those who want to paint all police officers as racist. And as you pointed out earlier, it's not so. Now, we know that there are some police officers who step over the line, and we all agree they should be held accountable. But to say that all police officers are racist is just plain wrong, and there are those people out there who use that mantra to decide it's time to get even with police. And the report also goes in and talks about Black Lives Matter and hands up, don't shoot. That's another motivating factor where Black Lives Matter and other individuals can go out and use that hands up, don't shoot as showing that police officers are just shooting blacks. When you and I both know, and your listening audience knows, that even the Obama Justice Department found that in Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot never happened. And yet,
no, it didn't. And by the way, it was. But see, the problem there, as was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Obama thought that the police were inappropriate in going after a particular black fellow, the fact of the matter was that it was absolutely correct, and Obama had to invite the officer down for a beer to the White House, as I recollect. In Ferguson, Missouri, this absolutely venomous Attorney General, Eric Holder, goes to Ferguson, meets with the parents as a way of saying, we're going to get Darren Wilson. And, of course, 3 forensic investigations, autopsies, found that, yes, Michael Brown came up to the car, was shot very at close range because he tried to get the gun away from Darren Wilson, the officer. And even the Justice Department's Criminal Division, which Holder gave full release to investigate, to get Wilson any way they could, and they couldn't do it because he acted properly. So you had the government, Barack Obama and his lackey, Eric Holder doing the outrageous aspect of coming to conclusions in advance, in that case and in Cambridge and elsewhere, diminishing the police and enhancing this message coming from the far left.
You're absolutely right. The other thing that the far left is doing is they're saying, well, another example and proof of racism in law enforcement is the fact that blacks represent 13% of the population, but they're arrested at a higher rate. So I went back and looked at some of the FBI statistics, and in 2016, on the those arrested for murder or negligent homicide, when broken down by race, 45% of those arrested were white and 53% are black. When it came to robbery, those who were arrested, 44% were white, 55% were black. But the most telling statistic is for those under 18 who were arrested for murder or negligent manslaughter, 36% were white, 69% were black. So the reason over 13% of those arrested are black is because they're responsible for more than 13% of the crime. But the left doesn't want to acknowledge that because that undercuts this whole racism theory. And what you originally had said about law enforcement officers who kill people in the line of duty, in 2015, 995 people were killed by law enforcement. 259, or 25%, were black. Of those, only a handful were unarmed. And as we found out in Ferguson, Brown was unarmed, yet he was going for Officer Wilson's weapon. That's why he ended up being shot. Yeah. And again, in 2016, 963 people were killed, 233 were black, and all but a handful, again, were unarmed. So then I started looking at this, and I said, well, where is the threat to the black community? Then I started looking at black-on-black homicide
There
rates.
we go. That's it.
I looked at Chicago. Right now, they've had 600 people killed. Over 80% were black, and over 80 victims were black, and over 80% of the assailants were black. And so this is where we should be. There were over 7,000 African Americans killed last year, a majority of them by blacks. So I started to think through this problem, saying, well, why are we looking at police officer killings when most of those are all justified? Why aren't we looking at the innocent people who were slaughtered in Chicago, Baltimore, L.A.? What's going on there? And I know you've written on this topic, you've looked at it, but it doesn't make sense to me that people aren't trying to come together and solve that problem. No one wants to talk about it. I mean, if we want to talk about criminal justice reform, let's talk about diversion for first-time nonviolent offenders, or treating drug addicts who are just in possession, not distributing, with rehab instead of jail, or talk about mental health issues, or even rehabilitation in prison for those that are going to be getting out, and we don't want to have them engage in recidivism. Why is it that we are being pulled apart in so many directions? I just can't figure it out.
Well, it's because it's an agenda on the part of Black Lives Matter, Antifa, George Soros, who leads the crowd in doing this. It's really his money that is instrumental in this. He just transferred $18 billion to his Open Society group, and so that's where that's coming from. But it's a false narrative.
Yeah, it is a false narrative, and also he's supporting new district attorneys. And one thing we learned in Baltimore, when Marilyn Mosby, the prosecutor, indicted those police officers, all in the mind of some people, it was a political act, not a legal act.
Well, the judges dismissed the cases.
It was the same judge. The judge was fantastic. He's African American. He was in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, and he found there was absolutely no evidence of criminality.
Right. And she did that as a political agenda, not about the police. And some of those officers who she indicted were actually African American.
That's correct.
So there you go. Bruce in Woburn for Stephen Thayer. You're on with Mike Siegel for Jeff Kuhner at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello, Bruce.
Mike, very nice to speak to you again, and happy Thanksgiving if I don't speak to you between now and then, because it's hard to get on because you're just as popular as the Kuhner man. But my main thing is I have a lot of friends that are police officers, and they're black, they're white, they're Asian. I mean, Burlington, Woburn, Bill Ricker, Boston. They all have targets on their backs. And it's the left is like, they're like with these Antifa and the Black Lives Matter people. They're backing these people like they have a right to be haters. And they're putting us out like be haters. And it's like a football team, Mike. Or it's like the military. There is no color. These are first responders. These are people that come. Even if you're a Muslim and you're in danger, and even if they don't like you, they're going to protect you. But they deserve to get targeted by these people. And why will you not do anything against these groups of people? And they're like pointing at like these people that were free speech people. The people that went against them were all Antifa people or Bernie Madoff, or it makes my head spin that no one cares about the good guy anymore.
I hear you, and I appreciate the call, Bruce, and I thank you for it. And you know, the real bottom line is that there are microscopic numbers of cases where police overreach. But you made the major point. We have, the last number I had heard was 92% of blacks in this country are killed by other blacks. 92%. Yeah. Now, it's certainly over 90%, and it's black-on-black crime. When did Jesse Jackson ever talk about it? When did Al Sharpton ever talk about it? When did Barack Obama ever talk about it? When did Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, which is a bloodbath city, when does he ever talk about it?
They don't, and that's the problem. And I think they're just looking at this police angle so people are not looking at what's happening in the inner cities and the black-on-black crime. And some people really cherish the undermining of our institutions, especially our law enforcement institutions. Bruce mentioned before about the officers being assaulted. In 2016, 57,000 officers were assaulted. In 2015, 41 were killed in the line of duty. 2016, 66 were killed in the line of duty, an increase of 61%. So for some reason, there are those that feel undermining society's confidence in law enforcement benefits them in some way, and it's just wrong.
Look at. I mean, this year I assume it's going to go up, and I don't know that, but certainly when you look at what happened in Dallas with the sniper shooting down at police officers in the street, when you had it happen in Baton Rouge, when you had it happen in Florida, in Brooklyn, I would think that the numbers this year are going to be very substantial of police officers killed in the line of duty. We just had another one killed over the weekend.
Yes, and an interesting one, people forget that in Dallas, Texas, 11 law enforcement officers were ambushed, 5 were killed. And what were they doing when they were shot? They were protecting a Black Lives Matter protest. And the shooter said, I wanted to kill white cops.
And so what do we do about that? Do we say that it's too sensitive an issue to do anything? You know, there were 2 cases I can think of where the police should be held accountable. One was in Charleston, South Carolina, where you had the fellow stopped for, I believe his light was out, and the officer came over to him, and then the guy started running away, and you see in video the officer shoots him in the back and kills him. The other one was in Chicago, where a young fellow is allegedly high, and he's got, I believe, a knife in his hand, and he's still some distance away from the 2 police officers that were standing there, but the one officer shoots him twice, he falls to the ground, and then he shoots him 12 more times. Those, to me, are cases which are clearly culpable on the part of those officers, but those are the minute exceptions and not the rule. Overwhelmingly, police do the right thing. We'll come right back and pick it up. 617-266-6868. That's the number to Boston. Mike Siegel in for Jeff Kuhner at the Voice of Boston. 2:20 it is at WRKO. You know, folks, there was a famous quote from none other than Jesse Jackson back in November of 93, and he was talking about the impact of crime on the black community. And Jesse Jackson said this: "There's nothing more painful to me at this stage in my life than to walk down the street and hear footsteps and start thinking about robbery, then look around and see somebody white and feel relieved. After all we've been through, just to think we can't walk down our own streets, how humiliating." End quote. Mr. Thayer, any thoughts?
Well, yes, it hasn't gotten any better. It's gotten worse. In the black community, the black-on-black crime is horrendous. The carnage is unbelievable. The pain and suffering, unbelievable. And the worst part of it is when the police officers who protect us are being yelled at and abused because they are so-called racists. What happens, they have this thing called the Ferguson effect, where police officers are not as proactive as they used to be.
Right.
They're not going into the crime areas. Well, can you imagine being in the black community, being a single mother with 3 kids, and hoping that that day did not bring the death of one of them, and seeing an incident, calling it in? That woman doesn't care what color the police officer is. She wants them to respond. But when we have this racist attitude, the police are less proactive, and that very much concerns me.
Let's go to Maria in Boston for Stephen Thayer. Maria, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello.
Hi, Mike. How are you? It's nice to hear you on the radio again.
Thank you.
I have a couple of things to say. First off, nothing's going to be done by these race baiters, Shopton and Jesse Jackson, because then they won't make any money. That's point one. Point two, Barack Obama planned this. He wanted us divided, and he wanted it to be this bad. And no one's going to tell me that that's not true, because we weren't like this until the Obama administration got in. We had our problems, but it was nothing like this. And three, why is it always, what's his name? Now I can't remember his name. Soros. He's always behind everything. Why can't we get him on something and get him out of the way? I don't understand that. Let
me say that I'll just give you my own editorial comment, and I've done a lot of research about Soros and done speeches about him. Number one, obviously he's got the best lawyers in the world, so he protects himself from having direct contact with these things. He funds Black Lives Matter, for example, but you can't get him on that because it goes through other organizations. You could perhaps, if you put the full force and weight of the Justice Department on him, you could do that. But Jeff Sessions won't even go after Hillary Clinton, who's committed about 11 prosecutable federal crimes. So how is he going to go after George Soros? There's not the will to do it. I will say that if he were a conservative, the Koch brothers are patriots, notwithstanding what Harry Reid said about them. They're great Americans. If they were doing what George Soros does in the way that he does it, you know that they'd be coming after him from the left-wing radicals in the Justice Department who are still there. That's my comment about that. Let's go to Rob next. Rob, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO, with Stephen Thayer. Hello.
Hey, good afternoon. Hey, Stephen Thayer. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, here's my point. As someone who's been to all these state gatherings, all the talking's a waste of time. If you saw the people that were there on Saturday, I don't know where you are located, Mr. Thayer. Are you located in the area, or are you out of the area?
Well, make your point, sir. We're running out of time.
Well, these are good points. Talk is doing nothing. The people that need to do things are the following. You can't have people like Marty Walsh take over the whole city.
First of all, we're talking about the problem overall, and that's why Mr. Thayer is here, about police. Obviously, Marty Walsh will not, with a sanctuary city, will not enforce laws in that regard, will not go after people who are clearly intent on committing harm to this community. The police are held back from doing their jobs in many ways in this community, so that's a whole other issue. But I appreciate the call, Rob, and I thank you. Mr. Thayer, about 30 seconds to wrap it up. What would be your final point for this audience?
Well, my final point is to pay attention, educate yourself, make sure you know what the attacks are when they're coming from the left, and understand why they're doing it, and also understand that they have a political motive, and that is to undermine the institution that serves us and keeps us safe.
The other thing I would say is every time you see an officer on the street, tip your cap and thank him for his service, thank her for her service, and let them know that you appreciate what the police do in not only in Boston, but wherever you may be. Mr. Thayer, thank you very much. Good to have you on the program, sir.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Take care. Meantime, 617-266-6868. What do you want to say about supporting the police? And if you are a police officer, I'd love to hear from you about the toughness of doing your job at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. We're back at it. Good to have you with us at 2:36 in the afternoon. Mike Siegel in for Jeff Kuhner. Welcome into the program. We've been talking about police mistreatment and misrepresentation by the media, by the left-wing radical groups who say that police are racist, when in fact the proof is that they are not racist. The proof is that you have 13% of the population being African American and 53% of the homicides, according to FBI crime statistics, having been caused by those of color. So you're going to see more attention paid to people of color. But if you look at all of the cases of allegations about police mistreatment of African Americans, what you find is the vast majority have had, where there have been grand juries, they've exonerated the police officer. There were two cases I mentioned before the break that justify police prosecution, and I'm sure there are others. The one in Staten Island where the officer put a chokehold on the fellow and the fellow wound up dying. He was saying, I can't breathe, although he was exonerated as well, that officer. So there's an overstatement by Antifa, by Black Lives Matter, to a great degree, and officers are now being targeted because of this radical ideology. Scott in Manchester, New Hampshire, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello, Scott.
Hey, Mike, how are you doing? Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
So a couple things. So there was a shooting yesterday in Goffstown, New Hampshire. It's a small town outside of Manchester.
I know Goffstown very well, yeah.
Yeah, 2 kids died, you know.
I used to live in Londonderry, by the way.
Oh, you're not far at all. Yeah, 20 minutes south. So 2 kids died, 1 shooter down. He died at the hospital. It's a sad situation. It goes a long ways with the people of the town. It's a big thing in the schools. And people are very scared and nervous. They had a lockdown situation up there. I know this type of thing goes on everywhere in the country, and people aren't even aware of what's really going on out there. But I'll tell you what, our police are men in uniform. We need to respect them, because if you don't give your license to them and they ask and you refuse, they have every right to rip you out of your car and arrest you. And I've seen videos of it, and that's where they're getting all. And it all comes down to their gun violence. They got to blame somebody, so it's the police they target, and, they're going after our guns, like we always say, and it just comes down to that. I just want to see your take on how this all affects the liberals, the Democrats saying, see, more gun violence, and we're going to, we need to get the guns,
Well, later in the week, I'm going to do on this program, and tomorrow or Wednesday I'll be here, a segment about this fact. We have 100,000 cases a year of people applying for firearms at licensed gun dealers who have to go through the federal system to clear you. 100,000 cases of fraud, lying on the application by the applicant for the gun. And somewhere between 30 and 40 per year were ever prosecuted by Eric Holder. Now, if you have 100,000 people lying and 30 or 40 are prosecuted, then if you're not enforcing that law, why should you have any more laws about guns? Because you don't enforce the laws that are on the books.
Absolutely. I agree. Yep.
Appreciate the call, Scott. Thank you kindly, too. Let's go to Tom in Boston. Tom, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello.
How you doing, sir? Thanks for taking my call.
Pleasure.
I'm a police officer. Been on for about 5 years.
Thank you for calling, officer. I thank you for your service too.
Well, thank you for having me. It's something I was always interested in. The biggest thing, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the crime stats, and that's just what they are, they're stats, they're facts. But the biggest thing I see with the media is what it's doing today is it's convincing people growing up that the police are a bad institution, that there's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. And forgive me if you've already hit on this, I just turned it on, but the biggest issue I see in the future is that there's not going to be kids growing up that want to be police officers. As a result, you're going to have less qualified applicants to choose from, and it's just going to hurt policing overall.
How tough is it for you, and I don't want you to mention the city you're in, we can keep this anonymous. How tough is it for you as a police officer? You're a full-time police officer? You're a full-time police officer?
Yes.
Okay, so every day, 5 days a week, presumably, you get up, you go to work. Do you have a family?
Yes, sir.
And you're married?
Yes.
The reason I ask is because I would think that your wife says goodbye in the morning, and there's maybe a little inkling of a thought in the back of her mind she might never see you alive again.
Well, we have a routine every night. I work nights, and whenever I leave, she says stay safe 100% of the time, even if we're in a huge fight. So it's got to be on her mind, and it's probably harder for her mentally than it is for me. But it kind of brings up another point too. Is you guys were talking about earlier is that a lot of police are kind of backing off what they do in terms of proactive policing, just because a lot of guys are, there's grumblings that it's not worth it to be the next YouTube video, or what's the point of going out and trying to get guns off the street if I'm just going to be portrayed falsely in the media if something goes sideways.
Yeah, I've heard that happen. It also depends on the city. I mean, I know when I was in Seattle that officers would tell me that, look, we're backing off. We're putting up our hands and saying, forget it. Because that city is very left-wing, not supportive of the police. And if you do your job, they're going to try to construe it that you're the culprit as the officer. The difference would be New York City under Giuliani between Seattle and New York is that in New York, the officers knew Giuliani had their back. Now de Blasio does not have their back. Correct?
Can't blame them. Why would you stick your neck out for somebody that wouldn't hesitate to throw you right under the bus, even when you're correct?
There you go. That's the problem with de Blasio. He tells his own kid to be careful about the police.
Right, and that's the biggest problem for me. If you tell your kids, and if you're indoctrinating your kids to be scared of police, then shame on you. That's not the message that should be being sent to kids. The police are. I see police in the community every day doing the right thing. Are there going to be police that mess up, as you were talking about earlier? Yeah, of course. The police are human. You're pulling from the human race. There's going to be people that are going to mess up. That's going to happen. But as an institution, I don't see these big issues, and I don't see people doing this job for the wrong reasons. Not today, anyways. You got
it covered. Continued safety, continued success, and again, thank you for your service, Tom. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
You take care. Jimmy in Dorchester, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Hello there.
Good afternoon, Mr. Siegel. This is what I have to tell you. Have you been in a courtroom in the last couple of months?
Not in the last couple of months, no.
All right. Okay, I go to Dorchester. I go to Quincy. I go to Dedham, right?
Yep.
You know who the judges are rewarding? They're not taking care of the victims. That's why a lot of African-American people are upset at the system. And they take it out on the police because you know who's failing them? The judges. You know who they reward? Not the victims. They reward the criminals. Do you know that pedophiles, instead of getting jail time, you know what they're giving them? And I've noticed it in 22 cases in the court system. They reward them with 30 days in Bridgewater, and then they let them back out on the street to go after the victims.
Listen, let me tell you something. I covered a case on the air of a guy who was the son of the head of the Department of Corrections, in the state where this took place, and this fellow and his fiancée had a baby. The baby was 6 months old, and he went over and astonishingly fondled the baby sexually and inappropriately. The fiancé comes in and sees this, throws him out of the house, and the guy gets 6 months behind bars. 6 months for doing that to a 6-month-old baby. You tell me where the system is going.
That's right. I'm stunned, sir. You got to go in there and see this for yourself. I know you're like a reporter, but you got to see this.
Oh, I've seen it, and I know that people get slaps on the wrist and all that sort of thing, and that's got to change. But the fact is, and I appreciate the call, Jimmy. Thank you. You know, one of the problems is that the officers make the legitimate arrests, and then people are given a pass. I'll never forget when I was teaching in Newark, New Jersey, and I was teaching 5th grade, and I'm walking down the steps from the main level toward the front door of the building. There's a little girl, 12 years old, crying. It turned out that a 15-year-old boy had raped her. And obviously I immediately reported it, brought her to the nurse. They took care of her. But in the end, the boy was out on the streets before she was out from under the medical care she needed because of that rape. I mean, this system has got to change. Ronnie in Boston, you're on the Voice of Boston, WRKO, regarding the police, and it's good to have you with us. Hello.
Hey, thanks an awful lot, Mike. It's always a pleasure to hear you when Jeff is out.
Thank you.
My biggest problem with this anti-police movement is that it plays both ends against the middle, which ends up with the police being unable to make a right decision either way. And I'll give you two quick examples. When crime goes up in an inner city area, the civil rights activists claim that it's because police don't care about those areas. So when the police move in more police to clean it up, the same civil rights leaders come out and say, see, these racist police are out to drag innocent black people away. That's one example. The second example, 20 years ago, all these civil rights activists were saying there's no diversity in police forces. We need more diversity in police forces. We need more black people being police. So over the last 20 years, police departments have bent over backwards to have more police, diverse police forces. And now 20 years later, what do the same people calling for diversity say? You're an Uncle Tom and a sellout if you're black and become a cop. I mean, how do you win with these people, Mike?
You don't, frankly, Ronnie, and I'll tell you this. The best example is in Baltimore. Baltimore has a black mayor, black police chief. There was a black prosecutor, Marilyn Mosby, mentioned earlier, of the police officers, and the officers, in large measure, are African American. And even with that, there are all of these complaints taking place about Freddie being in the back of that van and dying in the van, and all the furor about that. The people running that city are all African American. So, at some point you got to look in the mirror and say, well, where's the problem? The problem is maybe some kids in these communities are being raised, whether white or black, doesn't really matter, because if you're being raised in poverty and parents are not raising you with the right values, and you may only be living with one parent, your mother, and she has to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to survive, and therefore you're left alone, and you wind up at the whim of a gang or a group of gangsters out in the street, and you want to become part of them because they're your role models, they're your heroes, because they're making a lot of money compared to what you would be making working at a fast food restaurant. I mean, go on and on about this. And that's where the problems are, is to correct the behavior of the people to follow the law. It's very simple in terms of what needs to be done. It's very complex as to finding a way to do it properly and effectively. And that, for me, is where the problem is. The police simply are dealing with the results of a lack of discipline and a lack of dealing with proper values and following the law as young people should be trained to do, because then they wind up going out in the street and thinking they can do anything and think they can get away with it, and the police are stuck with having to enforce the law, and then, as Ronnie said, you get both sides going after you. It's a no-win situation for the police. 617-266-6868. That's the number to Boston. Mike Siegel for Jeff Kuhner at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. We're back at it. Good to have you with us. Mike Siegel in for Jeff today. It's a pleasure. Breaking story about 45 minutes ago. very interesting, to say the least. Glenn Thrush covers the White House for the New York Times. Now, let's put this in context, because the Harvard University study right across in Cambridge, and of course, if you're in Cambridge, you're there. It's not across anywhere. It's the Charles River. But be that as it may, Glenn Thrush covers the White House for the Times. We know from the Harvard study that something in the neighborhood of 93% of the stories about Donald Trump are negative. At CNN and the New York Times, I think, is about 85 or 88% negative. I mean, overwhelming. With Barack Obama, it was about 40% negative. And so Harvard, which isn't exactly a conservative bastion, it's a left-wing thinking at Harvard University, the reporting has been devastatingly negative toward Donald Trump, which demonstrates a lack of fairness, to say the least. And Glenn Thrush is part of that. So let me share with you what the New York Daily News just published in the last 30 minutes. A prominent New York Times reporter covering the White House has been suspended from the paper amid an inquiry into allegations he acted inappropriately with young female journalists. Glenn Thrush, who is so well known that he was portrayed several times on Saturday Night Live, plans to enter substance abuse treatment following the revelations, according to the New York Times. Apparently, Laura McGann wrote a piece published in Vox, and she's a former editor at Politico. Thrush worked there at the time, and she reported that Thrush, known in journalism circles in D.C. as a hard drinker who could be aggressive with young women at parties. Ms. McGann wrote that he put his hand on her thigh and began kissing her 5 years ago, an unwanted encounter that she suspected Thrush then spun to diminish her standing in the newsroom. You know, the basically, I guess, saying that she's easy or some of those sorts of things. Thrush tried to diminish this young lady, Miss McGann. In June of this year, apparently a 23-year-old journalist was left in tears after she resisted his advances. The young friend, a friend of the young reporter, texted Thrush the next day, and the friend wrote, "I want to make sure you don't lure young women, aspiring journalists, into those situations ever again." The friend of the victim was Bianca Padro Ocasio, who's also a journalist. So then Thrush comes out and writes this: "I apologize to any woman who felt uncomfortable in my presence, and for any situation where I behaved inappropriately. Any behavior that makes a woman feel disrespected or uncomfortable is unacceptable." But here's the rhetoric that these people are using. He says, "My recollection of my interactions with Laura McGann, the first one who wrote for Vox about his approaching her, putting his hand on her leg and then kissing her. He says, my recollection of my interactions with Laura differs greatly from hers. The encounter was consensual, brief, and ended by me. She was an editor above me at the time, and I did not disparage her to colleagues at Politico as she claims. The assertion that I would rate women based on their appearance is also false. I have never offered mentorship or reporting advice to anyone, man or woman, with an expectation of anything in return." Well, again, you have these kind of generic denials that you see. Al Franken, same thing. "Well, I didn't realize. He said the same thing. I don't recollect it the way she recollected it." It's interesting how these people try to kind of downplay what they did in order to kind of massage the reality a little bit. Isn't that fascinating? So Glenn Thrush at the New York Times, holier than thou New York Times, now has been suspended, and he's going to treatment, and we'll see where it goes from there as to whether others may come out with the same kind of scenario. There are other women as well, by the way, in the same situation with Glenn Thrush who've made these allegations against him. Mike Siegel for Jeff Kuhner. Great to be with you at the Voice of Boston, WRKO. Be good to yourself and the world the will be good to you. I'll see you tomorrow.
The Voice of Boston is you. 680 WRKO Boston, 93.7 WEEI HD2 Lawrence, Boston. It's 3 o'clock.